Howdy! Welcome to Moonlight Less Than Moonlight. I'm Justin, and today we'll be talking about Imani Elizabeth Jackson's Slow Coup for Ancient Music, which was published in issue 12 of Apogee. Imani Elizabeth Jackson, in her own words, is a poet, etc. For example, poems in Grammar Weekly, Flag Plus Void 11, Poetry Project Newsletter, Hold, Apogee, collaborations with Sean D. Henry Smith and Joe Stewart. Previously, I have been an artist in residence at F4F, Antenna Paper Machine, with Sean D. Henry Smith and Acre. Currently, I am an MFA candidate in Literary Arts, Poetry, at Brown. As usual, links to the poet's site, this week's poem, and any other sources are in the description below, plus the like and subscribe buttons if you feel so inclined. Content warning for race-based violence, and now, I'll wait here until you're back from the poem. Welcome back. Before we begin to talk about this one, I actually want to play a clip of Imani Elizabeth Jackson reading the poem herself, because I think it offers a good way to segue into some interesting topics.
Amiri, perhaps it had been nothing, as it has been for some time now. The main thing lately I've been against is death. Sometimes still I fall into feeling a love for you as casual as communism, futured as it could have been from the outset, something to look forward to in this slow coup.
As you might have noticed, this version of the poem is far shorter than the one that's in Apogee, probably because the later sections, as you saw, involve footnotes and graphical notations that can't be read aloud comfortably. But why all these notations if it prevents you from reading it? I think this question, and the poem's notations themselves, might become clearer if we jump back one step to the Amiri that opens the poem. Amiri Baraka was arguably one of America's most famous and infamous poets from his debut collection, prefaced to a 20-volume suicide note in 1961, up to his death in 2014. This fame and infamy follows his political growth, itself deeply informed by the times he grew up in, so let's begin with his founding the Black Arts Movement in 1965, the same year that Malcolm X, JFK, and Congolese independence leader Patrice Lumumba were assassinated. David Lionel Smith, in his essay, The Black Arts Movement and Its Critics, describes the movement as being integrally linked to the concept of the black aesthetic, and dismissive of all past black authors because they, quote, aspired to middle-class respectability, which the Black Arts Movement saw as a quest for mediocrity, end quote. Instead, Baraka and the Black Arts Movement members tied the history of the black aesthetic to music because, quote, it belongs to a tradition many centuries old, imported directly from Africa and developed continuously in the New World, end quote. Now there's a few problems with this approach. The less serious one is the implication of this music-oriented lineage. Smith points out that, quote, the aesthetic implied in the relationship between the music and the people is a very egalitarian, participatory one. The model does not stress roles of performer and audience, but rather of mutual participation in an aesthetic activity, end quote. How does one bring this to literature? For the Black Arts Movement in particular, the answer seemed to be the creation of the Black Arts Repertory Theater, which included spoken word poetry as well as plays, which Baraka also wrote. The more serious problem, and glaringly serious at that, Smith states as, quote, this is the logic of race, a logic created to perpetuate oppression and not to describe the subtle realities of actual experience. The choice of black aesthetic, rather than black aesthetics, represents a fundamental theoretical failure of the Black Arts Movement, end quote. And I would argue that from this essentializing we get to some of the other quote-unquote fundamental theoretical failures that young Amiri Baraka had, including an anti-Semitism that would find expression in his writing at this period of his life. I've included in the description maybe the most well-known, Black Art. Now, there was a piece published in December 1980 in Village Voice called I Was an Anti-Semite, where Baraka supposedly admits to feeling this way, says he doesn't anymore, and explains how it was driven by anger at the racist violence perpetuated by America. Since this doesn't seem to be archived anywhere online and all the libraries near me are shut down, I can't comment on the piece itself. I will say that in 1974 he distanced himself from the black nationalism that had informed his early works and became a Marxist-Leninist. The New York Times has him quoted as saying that, quote, it is a narrow nationalism that says the white man is the enemy, end quote. And it wouldn't be until 2002 with his poem Somebody Blew Up America that similar accusations would pop up. And with that, he stated that the poem was against the Israeli government and not the Jewish people, and it's a whole thing I'm not going to get into here. I've included the last drama written When We'll Worship Jesus from this period of political transition. But let's go back to the influence of music, especially jazz and blues, on Amiri Baraka's understanding of poetry. Because what inspired Imani Elizabeth Jackson's slow coup for ancient music is what Amiri Baraka describes as the Afro-American form of the haiku, the low coup. The low coup, spelled C-O-U-P, is a perfect congealing of Baraka's aesthetic history. A coup implies a revolutionary sentiment, but a low coup suggests both sadness in the spirit of blues and uselessness, seen in Blackheart's first two lines, "Poems are bullshit unless they are teeth or trees or lemons piled." His Marxist-Leninist-informed anti-religious sentiment are also clear from the first low coup. "The first thing we got to get," said the devil to the latest beggar of his soul, "is a much larger needle and a much smaller camel." And the reason I can't play the clip of him saying this is because there's a jazz performance in the background, therefore a copyright wall. It's very theatrical though, and he scats to the music, and it's a great watch. I recommend it. All that said, circling all the way back, let's look at Slow Coup for ancient music. The poem begins as an address to Amiri, presumably Baraka, followed by an underline. This underline is interesting because it suggests a pause and an absence, neither of which appear in Jackson's reading. So it's also a purely graphical quirk that still seems to be important since it's implicitly pointed to in the following line, "It'd have been nothing." Keep in mind the open parentheses that follows, because we'll come back to that. For now, note how the last line of the first stanza suggests that the main thing of the seeming conversation between Amiri and the speaker is being against death. The speaker, then, appears to be in a struggle state like depression. And note how this stanza is shaped like a traditional haiku would be, with the middle line being longest. Because, by the second stanza, this illusion of form is somewhat broken, with an interruption to the speaker's thought about being against death, sometimes still. The next few lines are probably my favorite lines in the poem.
I fall into feeling a love for you as casual as communism, futured as it could have been from the outset, something to look forward to in this slow coup.
The vowels in this section are very soft, drawing out the sense of futuredness and forwardness with their shapes, a sense echoed by the passiveness of falling and looking toward the future. But it hides exactly what the speaker is against, death, by the phrase "as it could have been." This love for you as casual as communism is invoked with despair, acknowledging its present non-existence, with another acknowledgement of the titular slow coup. What is the slow coup? Well, this leads to lying for poetic effect by saying the grocery delivery service Peapod provides, quote, "all my nourishment signed off on and delivered intact," end quote. Before the next open parentheses, there are two more graphical notations: the registered trademark symbol and the superscript on groceries that leads to a footnote reading, "eat it." All very weird at first glance, but we can start to sense something once we look at the parenthetical sentence, the truth that isn't for poetic effect. It is much starker and humbler, with a speaker in an economic condition where they overspend, wonder where all the money's gone, and feel they have no seal or surety. From this, it looks like slow coup is capitalism, where the poetic lie is depicted by excess in the shape of trademarks, a footnote directing us towards consumption, and the comfort of safe food delivery. This is a contradiction of experience most obvious with antonyms back-to-back in the phrase "signed off on." The truth contains something of the reality. There are legumes where the lie had Peapod, but it's shaped more by socioeconomic despair, presumably the death which the speaker has been against. Further, instead of a love as casual as communism, we get the hyper-individualism of "I feel so sad for my perineum, feel no fault but my own." You might know the perineum better as the taint. The footnote here is therefore both bodily and literal, as in the perineum is often called a little bridge between the anus and the sex organ, but also, in describing it as a fault line, it acts as a contradiction of that description. Not just because a fault line geologically depicts a point of rupture in the earth, but also because the word fault here plays off the idea of feeling no fault but my own. So we get the sense that, Where communism was a casual connection to others and offered continuity in the shape of something futured, capitalism is understood as the broken connections hidden behind the poetic effect of lies. So the parentheses of the third stanza ends, and an up arrow concludes the stanza itself. The most obvious question is, what is this arrow doing here? The sense I get is twofold. It works to point us back to the first open parentheses and towards the conclusion that this entire section has been an elaboration on "it'd have been nothing" from the first stanza. Read this way, it embodies the anxious urge to over-clarify, which includes 2 footnotes, remember. However, relatedly, it works almost like musical notation. It's pure symbol, literally pointing us towards something else in the same way a repeat symbol in sheet music doesn't make a sound, but points the musician to what sound to play next. Read this way, it parodies the idea of something to look forward to, since the arrow points us to repetition, to reiterating the speaker's struggle against death. Arguably, in the same way musical elements of spoken word poetry are unwritable, slow coup for ancient music attempts to create graphical musicality that is unspeakable. By now the conceit of a structured stanza, either imitating a haiku's shape like the first and second, or neatly box-shaped like the third, is tossed out entirely. The cleanliness, that's to say, falls apart, the lie revealed. These stanzas are energetic and bodily with reference to shit and skin, to erotic imagery of slide right in with that proboscis, land on me, and if you lick the fish, concocting the word, that animal. The language is a landscape of interconnected forms, and the erotic energy of it brings the speaker to suggest that you can break geometry with geometry, which interests me in particular because the abstracted, hard-edged mathematics of geometry seems to push back against the very images prior to it. But we'll come back to that. When the speaker asks, who else has played victim to the Atlantic, we're being reminded of the capitalist venture that was the slave trade, but the speaker is equally refusing to accept victimhood. They played victim. They say, I'm no victim really, but was carried. In a literal sense, the original slaves were carried to America, but also, in tying it to the present tense and associating carried with played, the speaker is emphasizing the social construction of victimhood and race. That victims of race are made. Equally so, but in juxtaposition, the speaker tells Amiri that love also carries, and it carries me somewhere else. Possibly a better somewhere else, since the stanza ends with them asking Amiri to try and break geometry with geometry, which, as said before, we'll return to, and an up arrow, which was discussed before. Amidst this sexually charged atmosphere and explicit imagery, we get what I see as the summation of the entire poem's ideas about love, life, and politics in the following. Please know there is a kindness to sweat. Laid here as such I become a lake. Please read the gesture and return it. When you say you feel good in this world we make, I say the feeling's returned. How good it is to return, not as charity, but of love. This feeling is not mutual, but returned. There's blatant cyclicality throughout. Return it, feelings returned, how good it is to return, not mutual, but returned. And this cyclicality is not charity or mutual. What do these distinctions suggest? Well, if we take the suggestion of laid here as such I become a lake, and return to the image of every body has potential as a puddle, if we look at these together with the question of who else has played victim to the Atlantic, we get an answer like this. The love for you as casual as communism invites a relationship that isn't given from a place of hierarchy, for example, of one person being charitable to another, nor from a place of purely similar interests, in the way that having mutual friends on Facebook doesn't mean you know each other. Together, these read as an indictment of the transactional lie that is the poetic effect depicted in the image of Peapod, and acts as an affirmation against death in the imagery of return invoked in the potential as a puddle. The puddle becomes a cloud, the cloud becomes rain, the rain becomes a lake. I'm trying on harmony with you, an elegant lesson in teaching geometry about geometry. The last line reads, harmony shares space with melody, each amplifying each, just as the speaker suggests when they say in the line before, and caught up in rapture and matched to your wearing. This wearing and trying on reads like a reversal of having played victim. In fact, in the way that it similarly points towards sexuality, but in the scientific nomenclature of perineum, and the fact that through this embodiment the speaker felt no fault but my own, we see having played victim as the shadow of trying on a harmony. Both are socially constructed, but one was the choice of the speaker. And in this is the lesson in teaching, of self-embodiment and taking possession of one's body so that it can be experienced outside the realm of charity and mere mutuality. Now we can clarify geometry. Before, geometry was something that broke itself, and was something which occurred within erotic encounters such as, if you lick the fish then swallow, and when you carry me somewhere else. The backslash in the poem's final line suggests that geometry about geometry is equivalent to trying on a harmony with you, an elegant lesson in teaching. A little cheekily, maybe the best way to imagine this is with the original 1980s Reese's Peanut Butter Cup commercial. A man with a chocolate bar and a woman with a peanut butter jar collide with each other, ending with the chocolate covered in peanut butter. Neither remains what they were. Rather, their now shared geometry becomes a new unity which shares features of each. The tastes harmonize, the harmony teaches harmonizing, and we might say that this harmonizing, quote, belongs to a tradition many centuries old, imported directly from Africa and developed continuously in the New World, end quote. But maybe not Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. So that's some thoughts on Imani Elizabeth Jackson's Slow Coup for Ancient Music, published in issue 12 of Apogee. Sorry about that last analogy. I couldn't help myself. But did you have a favorite line? Think any of my interpretations were off? Have a suggestion for future poems? I'd love to hear from you, whatever it is that's on your mind. And while you're down there, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and check out my sources if you're so inclined. Hope you have a great week, and until next time, thanks for stopping by.